The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for the month of October 2020. Today our topic is Beyond Roe. So first we'll introduce your hosts, who are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. The first voice you hear is Erin Matson, me. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, although I am currently temporarily living in Clear Lake, Minnesota, and I am Erin to the max on Twitter.
And I am Pamela Merritt. My pronouns are she and her. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri, and you can follow me on Twitter at SharkFoo. So the agenda for today's webinar is a quick introduction of Reproaction to those who are not familiar with the organization. And then Ivania Woods, our Missouri organizer, will give an overview of the topic Beyond Roe. And then we're going to introduce panelists, Samantha Lee, staff attorney at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, Mevy Mead, the Missouri Director of Policy and Organizing at Planned Parenthood Advocates in Missouri and Planned Parenthood Affiliates in Missouri, and Devin Gossbury, Director of Training at Midwest Access Coalition. After their presentations, individual presentations, we will go through some next steps and save the date for the next webinar, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions throughout this webinar, as each speaker presents, you can drop them into the question tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. I will collect those questions and try to get through as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. And if you are live tweeting today, please use the hashtag Reproaction. Reproaction leads bold, direct action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or the opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ivania.
Great, thanks, Pamela. Like Pamela said, I'm the Missouri organizer for Reproaction, and I'm based in Columbia, Missouri. You can find me on Twitter at @IvaniaStar. Next slide, please. So this brief review of Beyond Roe, and the reason that we wanted to have this panel today is to talk about how access to abortion and our advocacy for access to abortion must extend beyond the legality of the Roe v. Wade decision. So what we do know is that access to abortion is not just about legality. It is about our dignity and our humanity. We're fighting for our communities, our families, and our futures. And this messaging comes out of a national network of people working from organizations that are phenomenal in leading this work. And we're presenting it to you today, bringing it to you today to give you something to think about and also to help keep this movement innovative and progressing towards the change we want to see. So with that said, we're done compromising and settling for crumbs from politicians and from courts. We must do more than sustain existing abortion rights, because that alone will not ensure people can get an abortion. Again, legality alone is just not enough. Our vision is bigger. It's driven by our love, our compassion, and our commitment to justice. And together we want to build a power to create the future that we imagine. So what we do know is that white supremacy is the default for thoughts, behaviors, and social, economic, political stances. So we must actively educate and agitate ourselves and others. Abortion access is not just about morality, though the concept is weaponized to garner support by the opposition. We know that abortion access is about controlling half the population via reproductive oppression by limiting life choices, right? So Black, Indigenous, people of color, and young people are most directly affected, with poor white women serving as collateral damage in this eugenics-based agenda. So the point here is that abortion access doesn't start or stop with Roe, right? We already know legality doesn't ensure access. So where does quote unquote protect Roe get us? We want to be thinking more critically about that. And like, what's the point of only having the right on paper, right? Because we do know anti-abortion laws come with penalties for those who get abortions and for those who assist, whether it's someone giving you a ride or it's the physician or person actively engaging in the process, right? So something also to keep in mind and why this is such an urgent matter to discuss is because we have a SCOTUS seat that's open and we're getting a lot of messaging around and promoting the messaging around not filling that seat until after the election. Okay, so no, we don't want Roe overturned, and that can be a reason that we're antsy right now and filled with angst. Though that SCOTUS seat is significant and necessary, it's only a part of our fight for abortion access, right? We must have advocacy that is not only on the defense, but on the offense. We must proactively increase abortion access via innovative campaigns, initiatives, and policies, right? And some of the examples at Reproaction that we do, that we've been doing to address this work, like Pamela said, we're a left flank organization. We really work diligently to make sure that we're not just opposing the opposition as we should be, but that we're pushing people who consider themselves on the left, groups and organizations who consider themselves on the left, politicians who consider themselves on the left, further to the left. Our stance is extremely radical, and that's where we want to push other people. So our campaigns, like our Stop Prosecuting Abortion campaign, our Hold Fake Clinics Accountable campaign, our Self-Managed Abortion campaign, and more recently, Abortion Pills Are Magic campaign, where we're talking about increasing access via pills following the World Health Organization's protocol. And if you follow our work and keep up with us, then you probably have heard of one of those campaigns. So consider supporting our work and folding it into your own and figuring out how you can also help progress this movement, which is what we're doing today. Next slide, please. So again, the legality of abortion isn't enough. We're going to focus on that conversation today, talk about how reproductive justice principles must be employed in advocacy intended to increase access to abortion. And just as a reminder for those who aren't as familiar with those reproductive justice principles, we're talking about ensuring that people can decide if and when they decide to get pregnant or to give birth. We're talking about people being able to raise their families in safe environments and also being able to exercise sexual freedom without punitive measures being forced upon them. So reproductive justice is not just about protecting Roe, right? It's a fuller, more comprehensive picture that we've been working on, of the movement that we've been building, and we don't want to lose sight of that because we're so deep on the defense that we forget that this is a fight that's more robust than whether Roe v. Wade is overturned. What you'll hear about throughout these presentations is that, you know, Roe v. Wade is still legal now, but abortion access has been severely limited and is inaccessible for a lot of people in this country. So panelists will provide detailed analysis of the challenges and obstacles that people face while deciding if they want to get pregnant, while being pregnant and giving birth, and their decisions on like while they're trying to access those legal and safe abortions, what challenges and obstacles are they facing. So the panelists will be talking about the work that they do with their organizations and how they're helping to push their comrades and this movement further to the left and ensure that access to abortion happens for people who are at the center of this, those who are most marginalized, and yeah, that's good. So that is my wrap up for this. and we can move on.
Thank you so much, Ivania, and thank you for your work organizing this webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce Samantha Lee, who is a staff attorney for National Advocates for Pregnant Women, also known as NAPW. Samantha's pronouns are she, her, hers. And Samantha Lee is a human and civil rights attorney committed to people's inherent right to make their own decisions about their bodies, their families, and their health. And after graduating from NYU Law School, Sam served as a public defender in Brooklyn and representing parents against allegations of child abuse or neglect. More recently, she is engaged with Amplify Her, a New York City-based organization doing the groundwork to get grassroots transformational women candidates elected to represent their communities. She is delighted to bring that legal and organizing experience to NAPW's work. Welcome, Samantha.
Thanks, Pamela, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As Pamela said, I'm Samantha Lee. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, where we combine legal advocacy, public education, and organizing to secure the human and civil rights, health, and welfare of pregnant and parenting people and their families. If we can move to the next slide. As you all may know, people are criminally prosecuted or subject to punitive government intervention based on actions or inactions they take or do not take during their pregnancy. And so that includes abortion, but many other things as well. And we at NAPW challenge the legal, political, and cultural underpinnings of those punishments or interventions that are based on pregnancy or simply the ability to get pregnant. And I think everyone on this call knows that an explicit part of the anti-abortion playbook is to seek to define life as beginning at conception or expand protections for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. And in the popular narrative, using terms like fetal rights, the unborn child is all part of that push and things that we need to combat. Those justifications are also used to justify the detention of a pregnant person on the theory that it's in order to protect the fetus, charging someone with murder for experiencing a pregnancy loss, forcing someone to have a C-section rather than proceeding the natural birth that they want to pursue. So we need to expand our advocacy well beyond abortion rights and even abortion access, logistical access, to similarly attack this encroachment on people's civil and human rights, autonomy, and decision-making based on their capacity for pregnancy. Next slide. So I want to start with an example, California case I'm working on, Chelsea Becker's case, where she is charged with murder for experiencing a pregnancy loss. She has been in jail since November. She is held on $2 million bail. And the law that she's charged under, the murder statute, was rewritten to include fetuses following a brutal attack on a pregnant woman by her ex, where he purposefully tried to beat her up and end her pregnancy. And the purpose of the law was to increase protections for pregnant people who face this type of violence. And the legislators specifically excluded doctors who provide so-called legal abortions and the mother of the fetus, quote unquote, from prosecution under this statute. But even with those exceptions, as we see in the case of Chelsea Becker, Adora Perez, who was similarly prosecuted recently under very similar facts in the same location, feticide and murder laws that include the death of a fetus as part of their definition open the door for prosecutions of pregnant people for actions or inactions they take during pregnancy if they lose their pregnancy, if they experience a stillbirth or a miscarriage. So a better formulation of those laws is to center the harm that we're trying to prevent, is to center the harm to the pregnant person. So if we want to create protections for pregnant people who experience the types of assaults that led to the law that is now being used to prosecute Chelsea Becker, we would write, instead of the murder of a fetus, we would increase the penalties for assault of a pregnant person rather than a person who's not pregnant. So that's an example of a criminal prosecution. I want to turn to shocking civil action. So if we can turn to the next slide. There's a law in Wisconsin that allows the incarceration, forced medical treatment, house arrest, subjugation to other people's medical decisions, whether a partner, a parent, for pregnant people who are suspected of using alcohol or drugs. And in these minimal legal proceedings, in order to force someone into medical treatment, incarcerate them, put them on house arrest, etc., the fetus is guaranteed a lawyer and the pregnant person is not. And Reproaction and NAPW have been working together to combat this law in Wisconsin through education, political organizing, legislative advocacy, and litigation. If you want to learn more, you can follow this hashtag that I've put up. Reproaction also has a great page for the Wisconsin Fights 292 campaign. Or if we can move to the next slide, there's this great documentary, personhood documentary, that is being screened widely, and you can find a screening that works for you at the link that I've included here. Next slide. And an issue that jumps out to a lot of people when I talk about this Wisconsin law is that the fetus is guaranteed a lawyer and the pregnant person is not. To me, that is just so atrocious and really, really clearly shows that the fetus's interests are being defined in opposition to the interests of the pregnant person, when in fact, obviously, these two beings are completely inseparable. And more than that, the pregnant person is an adult person with civil rights, with human rights. And they do not give up any of those rights simply because they become pregnant. They have to still have the autonomy, the decision-making, the ability to obtain and pursue confidential medical care without fear of civil litigation, criminal consequences, other punitive government interventions. As soon as we create this opposition and rights for a fetus that are inherently going to be taken as oppositional to those of the pregnant person, we set up this really intractable problem that eliminates the rights of people who are pregnant. Next slide, please. A justification that I just want to touch on briefly that is often used to justify intervention on behalf of fertilized eggs, embryos, fetuses, to quote unquote protect them from their mothers, are the crack baby myth and similar myths about the harm of drug use on a developing pregnancy. And I just want to emphasize for a moment that those myths have been fully debunked. If you want more documentation of that, I'm happy to provide it. Please, please, please reach out. But if I can move to the next slide, every leading medical and public health organization that has addressed the issue of pregnancy and drug use agrees that voluntary, confidential healthcare is the most effective way to promote healthy mothers and healthy babies, which is all of our goals. And that this is a public health issue, and that substance use disorder, if that's really what's present here, and we know that there's lots of people who use drugs who don't have problematic use, it's a disease and needs to be treated as such. Next slide. But this is part of a larger trend of criminalization, and NAPW has tracked the arrests related to pregnancy nationally since Roe was passed. These numbers are likely an undercount because most of the places, in most places, those arrests are not part of a formal policy, but rather individual prosecutors choosing to prosecute someone, inventing a law or even acting contrary to the law in their state, as with Chelsea Becker, where explicitly the mother of the fetus cannot be charged with murder, but she is being charged with murder for having a stillbirth. Next slide. I don't have time to talk about all the ways the so-called child welfare system, better called family regulation system, is used to destroy families with similar theories. But I would encourage you, if you're interested, to read this Movement for Family Power report on that issue. And so then I just want to turn finally, thank you. I just want to turn finally to an area where anti-abortion activists are often surprised that their ideology works against them, and is actually a point where we can find allyship with people who are more traditionally anti-abortion. And that's in the instance of forced surgery. So in this case that I've highlighted here, Renate Dre in Staten Island, New York, is noted by her doctor to have decision-making capacity. And the doctor decides to ignore it and force her to have a C-section. And these cases are not hugely common, but they happen all over the country. And so I just want to highlight that, and the justification obviously is theoretically the doctor for some reason thinks that this might be a better outcome for the fetus, but Renate Dre was a person with decision-making capacity. And this was her body that they were talking about cutting open. And so she should have retained the right to make that decision for herself and her family. So this issue isn't just about abortion or even ability to access an abortion. It's also about these larger questions of bodily autonomy, medical decision-making, the theories that come out if we start defining fetuses as having independent life and independent rights. Next slide. So we can see from these examples how inadequate it is to look at this as just a matter of lack of access to health services, although that's crucial, or lack of individual rights, though that's crucial. As Avonia said, this is part of larger systemic social, political, racial, economic problems in our country, and we need to approach these issues with that lens. Forward Together, formerly Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, and one of the founding members of Sister Song, wrote a fabulous report that has really detailed descriptions of these three categories. And so I would encourage you to look at that if you're interested. Next slide. So there's a lot of work to do. I know Reproaction and the other folks speaking on this call are doing a lot of that work. If you would like to connect with me, I've put my email here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Well, I am going to move us to our next panelist, who is Mevy Mead, who's the Director of Policy and Organizing at Planned Parenthood Advocates in Missouri. Mevy uses she, her pronouns. Here she is getting arrested. She's so awesome. We love working with Mevy. Mevy is a mother of 2 boys with 25 years experience in political organizing work on women and children's issues. She worked for NARAL and the National Association of Child Advocates while in DC. She was a former executive director of NARAL Missouri and subsequently led a NARAL Missouri Foundation and Planned Parenthood affiliates joint project called Show Me Choice 2000. She's held several leadership positions within Planned Parenthood, including chair and secretary of the State Public Affairs Network and the project director for the Path to Power Public Affairs and Organizing Model Initiative. She's now the director of policy and organizing for Planned Parenthood Advocates of Missouri, where she works with the public affairs and grassroots organizing staff of the 2 Missouri Planned Parenthood affiliates to engage supporters in the political processes of advancing and defending Planned Parenthood's education and medical services. Mevy, thank you so much for making the time to join us this afternoon, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a little depressed to be here, but I'm really glad to be in this conversation with the amazing advocates and the supporters, and of course Reproaction and your fearless leading from the left. So thank you. I'm honored to be here. So on the next slide, you'll see who actually made up the name of this presentation. I can't take credit for it. If we move there, you'll see that this is how Alexis Mcgill Johnson, who is the president of Planned Parenthood Action Fund, the national organization. This is how she's talking about Roe when getting asked about the Supreme Court vacancy and the fight that we have on our hands. And so Roe is the floor, not the ceiling. I think what this webinar and the folks who are doing this work and hopefully on board watching this webinar are seeing that that is a reality we need to recognize. And frankly, in hearing that previous presentation and thinking about my experience in Missouri, which is why I think I was asked to join this conversation, the floor has cracks in it for sure. And people and healthcare is falling through those cracks. And here's why. I'll look at the next slide and pretty stark example about what kind of floor we're looking at and how it is applied across the country. So the darker red the state is, the more restricted the access to abortion is. And I would say that while Roe was standing, Missouri tipped into the black, and we're back providing with just one remaining licensed health center in the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it took to hang on to that license in my case study. But I will say that the restrictions combined with the pandemic led the chief medical officer this spring to suspend provision of services at that last remaining health center because of a physical 2-visit requirement in order to access the abortion was deemed not medically appropriate given the pandemic in terms of trying to protect the patients, who comes with the patients, and the providers. And so the combination of the restrictions and a pandemic, even while Roe stood, pushed Missouri into the eliminated access for the time being. And even though there is limited access returned, we'll talk more about what that looks like. So on the next slide, I just want to say that I get it. This is a ridiculous slide to have as a presentation, and there is no way I expect you to read it, although feel free to start zooming through it, but we're not going to be on here long. The next 3 slides actually are ridiculous, and I am joking a little bit, but it's actually fitting. We're going to stay on that first one for a minute here, and it is actually symptomatic or emblematic of how ridiculous these laws are. So I am in theme here. This slide shows all the laws that were enacted from 1973 to 1999 in Missouri, most of them, if not all, medically unnecessary. I do want to point out that in 1975, they added an annual inspection of ambulatory surgical centers that was required in order to have the license of that center renewed. So that's been on the books since 1975, and we're going to talk about how the collision of politics, an emboldened politician, leader in Missouri, and health department director weaponized that provision that's all the way back from 1975. So if you go to the next slide, this is a set of laws that were enacted from 2001 to 2010. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see what's been enacted from 2011 to 2019, all medically unnecessary laws restricting actually sexual and reproductive health, so some on family planning, but most of them on abortion. And so you can see that the Missouri legislature and political apparatus has been busy when it comes to eliminating or eroding access to abortion since the minute Roe was established. And on the next slide, I hope you enjoy my DIY graphic arts here. This is what you get when you have me working from home and I'm not sitting next to the professional design people. But anyway, I hope it gets across the point. What I'm trying to show and tell here with this slide are exactly what targeted regulation of abortion providers are and why we very cleverly and illustratively came up with the acronym of TRAP, because it puts patients and providers in a trap. So what you'll see in the dark part of the circle are all the three previous pages of laws that are pressing on the patient's ability to access and the provider's ability to perform abortion. And then you see on the pink circle other pressures on the patients and providers. So one, I just made the category life. So that's things like that you have a job and that you have children. And those are things that could make it difficult for the patient to access, especially when you think that we have a 2-visit requirement, both in person, in order to get the safe, legal, medical procedure. Also, in the 80s, Missouri passed a law preventing private insurance from covering abortion, and now we know that is an option for states according to the Affordable Care Act as well. So then money comes into a picture. Even if you have health insurance, that could be a barrier to getting your patients. And another thing about life, like getting sick, even outside of this pandemic, if you get sick, you miss your appointment. But in Missouri, when it comes to abortion, if your doctor gets sick on the time of your scheduled procedure, you don't get to have that procedure. The person covering for that doctor cannot step in and provide your safe medical procedure because of the medically unnecessary TRAP law that you have to have these 2 meetings with the exact same physician who's going to do the abortion. So the other pressure here that we're going to talk more about and how it was used in Missouri is when you have an ethical, politically motivated leadership that is willing to weaponize their role as a regulator in the oversight of how the TRAP laws are applied. And that what this does and what my image is supposed to show, that it squeezes that patient and provider middle until literally they cannot get out of the trap created by the policies, life, and implementation of the policies. They can't get out of that trap to provide or access the actual safe medical procedure. So let's look at the next slide. So the Missouri example of how this lived itself out in the past 1.5 years, 2 years, is that when Governor Parson came into office with a solidly anti-abortion, aggressively anti-abortion agenda, and really empowered his very strange health director, and strange is being kind here, Randall Williams, to abuse their oversight role. So remember that annual inspection requirement. It's required at what sits between abortion provider and its ability to provide abortions is a license to do so legally. And so they weaponize that annual review process, and basically we're using their weaponized interpretation and changing the goalposts with how they applied the regulations in a way that they could refuse to renew that license. And in thinking about the power analysis here, when you're talking about an entity that has the trust and the power to regulate how healthcare is provided in a state, they do have most of the power in that situation. And even in settings where the regulated entity can dispute maybe how the rules are being interpreted or applied, generally the regulator wins those in both the administrative processes, the legal processes, and in the in the court of public opinion. So it got so bad in Missouri that what the Planned Parenthood there decided to do was try and alter that relations of power and push back. And it just as an example of how far it had gotten is that the health department was trying to require that patients get 2 medically unnecessary invasive pelvic exams prior to accessing an abortion in the state. And the health centers, the doctors, everybody just said, that's it, we cannot do this, we've got to fight back. And ultimately, after showing all of the level of public outrage over this, so it took, and having excellent legal reputation and having people willing, not just me, willing, other people willing to take a rest. We didn't want to leave any tactic unexamined in our attempt to show the breadth and depth of the public opposition to this, and use all of the legal levers to ultimately, after an over a year-long battle in court, like I said, and in the court of public opinion, that state was forced to renew the license. But they can't change the fact that it's an annual situation, and so depending on how the outcome of the elections go, it's the same regulator who could be looking at that license next year. So to the next slide. So this is what gives me hope. A great organizer named Margaret Eaton taught me about this equation long ago, that it's fear plus hope that equals action, and that we've just spent a lot of time on the fear. So I want to focus in a little bit here about what gives me hope, and hopefully gives you hope, that will lead to action. And we need all of the elements of this equation in order to make the kind of social change we want. And I really like how Ivania set up this webinar, and even in what Reproaction stands for, because it is pushing the vision that we need for hope that is equal to what we have to fear to demonstrate and get us to the level of action that we need. So frankly, I think, I've been in this movement for 25 years, and there are a number of places where I can see that we set in the reproductive health and rights realm the bar too low, and it's time for change, and change is happening in these large institutions, of course, that I'm a part of with Planned Parenthood. And so what is giving me hope is that we are together looking at both the internal and external what it's going to need to attack abortion stigma with an emphasis on equity. Ivania mentioned at the top that all of this is happening both in the context and in service of white supremacy, and that I'm a white person, particularly has to address it with that lens and think as big as the situation calls on us to think. And I'm telling you that work is recognized. So recognition is, I think, the important first step to action, and action is being developed within these institutions, but not in isolation, in together with the other organizations on this call and in this work. As I mentioned, I think we still need to continue demonstrating the depth and breadth of support for real access, but not just to the right, to this creaky floor we have with Roe, but to real reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. I think we still need to use the legislative, electoral, administrative, and legal process as opportunities to set up our bigger victories. And so an example of that we're looking at in Missouri is how to not just hopefully win an election and change who is running and pulling on the levers of government, but actually empowering the people of Missouri to enshrine reproductive freedom in their constitution. Surely a risky and unusual strategy, but one that, like I said, we're not leaving any tactic idea unturned, unexamined, and that's the kind of stuff I feel like we need to do. And I think we also need to build medical and patient evidence for the best patient-centered care and access to abortion, and the leading work that the World Health Organization, Reproaction, and now the healthcare providers are doing the actual evidence-based research that will support how to remove some of these, what used to be thought of as medically appropriate, but really are not, restrictions between a patient and their medication abortion. And then I think finally, and part of why I was really excited to be on this call, is that we need to be real with our supporters about what it's going to take to win access, and that it's not just winning an election or a particular legal battle, and that as we are successful, which is one of the things I think we've seen as part of the Missouri example, is that the more success we have, the harder they come at us. So when people are feeling like, oh my gosh, I've been standing up for abortion rights forever, and I can't believe I'm back here. There's some great memes about, older people saying they can't believe they have to stand there with this effing sign. Well, you know what? We are going to have to stand there because the more we push back and build power, the more they're going to come at us. So that's actually should be seen as a sign of power, and that you need to continue to engage and alter that power. So ultimately, we're able to realize the vision that we all share for reproductive justice and freedom. So with that, I'm finished. And I think the final slide is just about my contact information and how you can access all the handles, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram you'll all find that on the ppmissouri.org website, and then our national website is up there, and then my email is up there. And the final slide, Erin, is about taking questions, but I think we're just going to move on.
Thank you so much, Mevy. That was amazing and inspiring, and you couldn't see me fist pumping. I will pass it now to Pamela to introduce Devin. And if anyone has questions for Mevy, just put them in the question tab, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. So it is my pleasure to introduce Devin Gossbury, Director of Training and Client Coordinator for Midwest Access Coalition. Devin is a practical support, Midwest Access Coalition is a practical support fund based in Chicago. Through MAC, she works to eliminate barriers to abortion access with a client-centered approach. Outside of MAC, she is a doula supporting individuals at different stages of their reproductive and parenting journey. Devin currently lives in Chicago with her partner. Thank you so much for joining us. Take it away, Devin.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Gossbury. As Pamela mentioned, I am a Director of Training and Client Coordinator for MAC. Midwest Access Coalition is a Midwest-based practical support fund, but we are not limited to supporting folks in the Midwest. We support folks traveling to, from, within the Midwest, and are constantly expanding our reach. So some of you may be wondering what the term practical support means, and that's really what we're going to talk about today, specifically in the context of abortion access. I think that there was a lot of conversation about things that are pretty scary, quite frankly. So hopefully, discussing practical support and talking about that will be a bit inspiring for folks. So we'll start with a little bit of history. For me personally, when I think about practical support, it's tied to mutual aid, which in this age of COVID, we've probably seen that term more in our day-to-day than some folks may have seen in the past, but it's really something that has sustained communities for decades. So just to give you all a definition, mutual aid is a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another in changing political conditions. So this is a standard definition, but for me, it really doesn't define mutual aid at its core. at its core, I think mutual aid is really about the idea of we've got us, right? So no matter the shifting and changing landscape of laws, systems, leaders, however competent or horribly incompetent they are, we always have on the ground community care, and we may have to push against what's defined as acceptable or even legal if those things are causing our communities harm in order to sustain ourselves. And this is really comes down to people power, and we see this throughout history. So, for example, the Black Panther Party, which formed in 1966, one of the most notable things that they did for their communities, or at least one of the things that we hear about a lot of the time, is around 1968, this is really interesting to me. You know, MLK was murdered, MLK Jr. was murdered, and in Oakland, they started the free breakfast program, which ended up expanding across 19 cities and is part of the reason why we have free breakfast programs in schools today. And what Black Panthers stand for is, you know, the idea that we are self-determined and we have the ability to protect and sustain our communities, and not only, you know, waiting for crumbs, we want our communities to thrive, and that's what we aim to do. And I really do think that's one of the key tenets to mutual aid. Another group, the Young Lords, which started here in Chicago, also was very deeply rooted in mutual aid and community care. Just a little history: at the time in Lincoln Park, a largely white and affluent neighborhood currently, but which was largely Puerto Rican community back then, the group was formed because they were getting displaced out of their community. And like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords were driven by self-determination. So they were looking out for the community and making sure the community was taken care of. But they weren't only doing that, they were pushing back against, back through action against the systems that oppress them. So they're very much known for some of the actions that they took in order to change the policies and really push folks to invest in their communities and pay attention. And then some of you all may be very familiar with Jane, which is a collective, also around the time in the 1960s and 1970s before Roe was passed, a collective that provided affordable abortions in a safe environment, which is, you hear a lot about, I feel like there's this narrative of like quote unquote back alley abortions. And I think one of the things that makes Jane really a really interesting model in terms of mutual aid or practical support in abortion access is that they fought to make sure that abortion was always available and that it was affordable, and they valued privacy and tried to make the process as safe as possible, even in the environment that they were in. And there's a few other groups here, Food Not Bombs, which you all may be familiar with, the Common Ground Collective, which came out of disaster, which provided disaster relief to their community after Hurricane Katrina and really expanded to do more work within the greater New Orleans area. And of course, you know, with COVID-19, I feel like there's always been mutual aid networks, but you hear about them much more often because of the way the government is just so poorly handling you know, relief and support for our communities across the country. But these are all examples of mutual aid. So next slide. One of the things that I want to point out about these groups and just about mutual aid in general is that it's really not charity. It's not what you think of when you think of a standard nonprofit. We are not here to pull anyone up. We understand that systems and policies and leadership changes happen, but we create our own systems to ensure that we are good and to push back against those systems that oppress us. And we aim to understand what folks need, and we don't assume. So we're showing up for people in the ways that are going to most benefit and help eliminate barriers. And we don't work in silos, and we try to avoid hierarchies, right? So usually with these groups, when you think about mutual aid, you're thinking about things that are hyper local or community focused. And oftentimes they're volunteer based. So there's not a lot of money necessarily being thrown at folks, donors and things like that. Mutual aid really gets at the heart of being community care. And communities can be defined in any number of ways. But, it's beyond just your family or your friend group or things like that, and a lot of this is not only seen in the groups that I just talked to you about, we see a lot of this in the abortion access world as well. Next slide. So I won't get too much into this, but I did want to highlight and give examples of abortion funds and groups across the country that really display some of these tenets that I talked about with abortion care and practical support. So obviously Jane, which I spoke to, Access Women's Health Justice, based out of California, who's been doing this work for a very long time and really does practical support well. So we're looking beyond a procedure-based funding model and really looking at what the person's needs are. How are they going to get their care? How are they going to do that safely? And what support can we provide to them so they don't feel isolated and alone within this process? Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund. The South is a minefield, and it's only going to get worse, it looks like. But groups like the Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund really seek not only to provide access to abortions, they provide free emergency contraception, period supplies, and diapers for families. And that's that whole idea of there's not just that one thing. We're looking at people holistically in our communities and how to support them. And then Fund Texas Choice. So this is one of many groups in Texas that really just was really extremely impacted by COVID-19 specifically. So, one day a clinic would be closed that would be like 3 miles from a person's house, and then these folks would have to find ways to travel outside of their state when they had an appointment on Tuesday. So they'd have to reschedule their appointment, find a place else to go because of the laws that were quickly changing and how politicians were using COVID as an excuse to prevent folks from getting the care that they need. Groups like Fund Texas Choice we've partnered with. Another one that comes to mind is New Orleans Abortion Fund to get these folks plane tickets, train tickets, whatever they needed to get the abortion care that they need. Bridget Alliance stands out for me because they really deal with providing long distance transportation for people having to travel outside of their state for care due to restrictions in their state. And then Kentucky Health Justice Network, I feel like, is a really great hyper-local example of practical support care. And one of the programs that they have is the Trans Health Advocacy Program. So again, we're looking beyond just abortion. We're looking at people's needs and how we can really sustain our communities and make sure that they have the reproductive freedoms and the things that they need. Next slide. And this is really important, especially in this time because of the current landscape. As of, and this may have shifted a bit since I've created this slide, but as of 2019, the end of the year, 45 states allow individual healthcare providers to refuse to participate in abortion. 42 states allow institutions to refuse to perform abortions. 27 major US cities and much of rural America qualify as abortion, quote unquote, deserts. As defined by Amnesty International, the cities or areas where population majority lives more than 100 miles from an abortion provider. 6 US states have only one clinic providing abortions. And 14 of these states have laws that effectively require someone to make 2 separate trips to the clinic to obtain the procedure. So you can only imagine if it's really difficult to get there once and you're asking someone to make an unnecessary trip, how much of a barrier that can be. And And proposed 6-week abortion bans have increased by 63% since 2018. So we're here, practical support funds are here, and this shifting landscape is getting worse and worse. And as you all know, as of September of this year, the Supreme Court will obtain conservative majority with the addition of nominee Amy Coney Barrett, which I am not going to speak into existence. I know I said that, but we'll be here. And our networks are strong. And, you know, with these changing things, this may change and expand the work that we have to do, but we're always going to show up for the people that are seeking abortions across the country. Next slide. So just to give you all a better idea and to define practical support a little bit better, as a fund, Midwest Access Coalition and the other funds that I mentioned, as well as other funds across the country, we really seek to identify and work with folks on things that they may need outside of their procedure to get to their appointments. And, you know, if they have any family members, a companion, friends that are going to be traveling with them as well for support, we try and cover those resources as well. So here you have transportation that can look like a ride, it can look like a flight, a bus or train ticket. And then I think sometimes too, people forget about those little ancillary costs. So even parking or tolls will help to cover the cost of that. We'll usually pay for a plane ticket or a bus train ticket round trip for the person and if there's someone traveling with them. Lodging, that looks a lot like hotels now, but you know, there was a point where we were doing temporary homestays with folks. Food, cash, food delivery, snacks, groceries, we've done all of those before, and I know a lot of other groups do that as well. And next slide. Practical support also looks like childcare, finding babysitters for folks, coverage of childcare costs if needed. And I know certain groups, I know Mississippi Freedom Front specifically will do diaper distribution. So if folks need diapers for the babies, they'll cover that too. And then emotional support. So we have on-call hotline support that we can provide. And there's a lot of groups as well that have doula or companion support. So if there's someone that's traveling alone and they need that additional in-clinic support, there are folks available to be there for them. And then healthcare costs. So procedure costs, medication, contraception, tampons, pads as well. All of those things beyond the procedure costs, we will help to support. And this is all, next slide, rooted in reproductive justice. I'm gonna, yes. I was just gonna say.
This is Pamela, and I hate to interrupt, but we're coming close to time, and I apologize sincerely that we were compressed a bit, so you got a little less time than the other presenters, and I'm so sorry for that. But if we can go to your contact slide, so people can reach out to you, and I am so sorry.
No, it's fine. We, so I'll just end on this. We are Practical Support Fund. I just covered that. If you all want to reach out to us and connect with us, please feel free to go to our website. We have Facebook, Twitter at Midwest Access, and we're on IG too, so you can follow us. I'm happy to continue this discussion offline, so please feel free to reach out. And thank you all so much again for having us.
Thank you so much, Dev, and I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you so much, Devin, and thank you to all of our panelists. This has been fabulous. Just want to put in a plug before we close. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions today, but you know what? If you want to move beyond Roe, Reproaction is a place to do this work. Come to our website. We've got tons of places where you can take action, as well as checking out NAPW, Planned Parenthood Advocates of Missouri, and Midwest Access Coalition. Do want to put in a plug to please save the date for our for our Act and Learn webinar next month. We'll be meeting on Tuesday, November 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern, and our topic will be a big one. We're going to talk about racism and anti-abortion fake clinics. So with that, I'll close this up, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists. This has been an enriching discussion, an outraging one, and I hope everyone listening is inspired to action. We must move beyond Roe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.